And I'm John Young with Friends of Morrow Mountain State Park, and I just wanted to thanks for the strong support the Hardaway American Indian Museum has already received from the town of Badin, our museum working group, the Stanley County Historical Society, the town of Badin, Three Rivers Land Trust, Stanley County Convention and Visitors Bureau, Stanley County Economic Development Commission, and the Board of County Commissioners in Stanley County. All have been very supportive and passed resolutions of support for this state museum to go forward. We're also eager to work with the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources as we grow this project. The Hardaway site is certainly one of the most important archaeological sites in the U.S. and eastern U.S. And the story of these first peoples and the first Carolinians and a lot of the history of archaeology is all tied into this incredible site. It goes back at least 12,500 years ago. We're excited today to have Dr. Randolph Daniel. Dr. Randolph Daniel is chair and professor in the anthropology department at East Carolina University, where he has worked since 1996. Randy Daniel received his PhD in 1994 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research interest includes the archaeology of prehistoric hunter-gatherers in the southeastern U.S., particularly hunter-gatherer adaptations at the end of the last ice age. Perhaps no one has more carefully and closely studied the many tons of stone artifacts now housed at the research labs of archaeology at UNC, excavated by Geoffrey Coe and others in their historic and foundational research at the Hardaway site in the late 1940s up until 1980. Dr. Daniels is also has loads of articles and two significant books. Hardaway Revisited he did in 1998, where he comes to an incredible conclusion that the unique rhyolite in the Quarry mountain area and at Morrow Mountain State Park was one of the major reasons that people were attracted to this region. And his newest book, 2021 book, Time, Topology, Point Traditions in North Carolina Archaeology, where he provides a comprehensive and critical reassessment of the work of Geoffrey Coe and other archaeologists in this early history of North Carolina. But we're excited to have Dr. Daniels with us today, and he's right here.
Thank you, John. And I really appreciate everybody being here this afternoon. On the way driving over earlier in the day, I ran into some pockets of rain, but then the skies cleared up and it was a great spring day, and I thought, boy, it's a great spring day. And then I thought, uh-oh, it may be too good that people might not want to spend their afternoon inside, they might rather be outside. So I am heartened by the attendance here today. As a professor and an archaeologist, I enjoy talking about what I do for a living, right? And I realize there's a great public interest in that, and I like to do as much as I can to promote that. So there's no better topic to promote than the Hardaway site, right? And I think that the attendance here is indicative of the level of interest in this site. So let me just briefly give you a roadmap, an overview of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. First, I'll talk a little bit about the history of the site, how Hardaway was discovered, the context of that, and then I'll get right to the various levels of significance, right? John asked me to talk about sort of why and how is the Hardaway site significant. And I think there's various categories here that speak to that level of significance. First is its research significance. That's obvious for what it can tell us about the earliest North Carolinians. I'll talk a little bit about that. Then it's educational significance. Education in the sense of training of students, of which I was one, right? If you ask my wife, the most significant contribution Hardaway has was to get me out of school, right? And so as a graduate student. And today the collections are still being utilized as a training tool. But there's also a public education aspect to the Hardaway site, and that's why I'm here, right? And so that's one of the other things I'll talk about. Then there's a less obvious level of significance that I want to address, and that's stewardship, right? Stewardship, and that's what this proposed museum wants to do to further contribute to our understanding of the Hardaway site. That's what stewardship was, what Alcoa did when it donated the site to the state park system, and I'm just elated that happens, right? So stewardship is part of the significance of Hardaway. And then last but not least is that Hardaway serves as a model of collaboration between professional and avocational archaeologists. And by that I mean Geoffrey Coe is a professional, and Herbert Dorschuk, who showed Coe the Hardaway site, right? That was an unprecedented sort of level of cooperation that without that collaboration, we all wouldn't be here today talking about that. And so sometimes I think that is overlooked, and we should think about that as we talk about the level of significance of Hardaway. All right, site location. Well, I think everybody in the room knows where Hardaway is. So it's high above the Yadkin River, on the west banks of the Yadkin River. This is my high-tech pointer, all right? Right, and so this is a LiDAR map. It's basically it's a topographic map in color, right? And so you have the river kind of running through here. That's the Yadkin River. This is the Uwharrie River. And then the Uwharrie Mountains, this chain of Uwharrie Mountains, that'll become important in a minute, right? And then the Hardaway site, again, on the west bank of the Yadkin River. Of course, the Yadkin River looks very much different today than it did when the earliest peoples came into this region, right? Because of the building of the dam and the flooding and creation of Badin Lake, right? But the prominence of the location of Hardaway site still is, I think, a significant feature of the site. And you can't talk about Hardaway without talking about a couple of other sites down the river. I'll touch on these. Lowder's Ferry, further down on the west bank, the Dorschuk site on the east bank, and then of course Morrow Mountain itself, a very different site than any of those other three sites. And I'll be referring to those as we go along. Hardaway, as I mentioned, was shown to, can you all hear me in the back? Right? All right. As a professor, I've learned to project my voice in large classrooms, right? And as the parent of triplets, I've highly honed my projection skills, all right? So usually my students don't have a problem hearing me. All right, so this is a photograph from Town Creek. Town Creek's right down the road too, right? 1930s. Herbert Dorschuk, who was a resident of Badin, an electrical engineer, was an avid collector. And he collected from a number of sites. Significantly, he reached out to Geoffrey Coe at UNC in thinking that perhaps these sites along the Yadkin River are significant. And so he showed those to Coe, and here's a young Geoffrey Coe here in the middle, and to his left is Herbert Dorschuk, right? And this is what the Hardaway site looked like back in the day, right? That Dorschuk did a lot of collecting. And so it took a few years. There's some initial test pits done at Hardaway and at Dorschuk and Lowder's Ferry, the other sites, to essentially see what the potential was for these sites. And there's excavations were intermittently undertaken over several decades, but there's two main blocks of time in the late 50s and in the mid to late 70s that received the preponderance of the excavation. And this is a map. These little blocks are a 5-foot square, and basically this is a plan view of the location of these units that were excavated at Hardaway. In total, there was over 140 5-foot squares were excavated. And Coe's work, the famous Formative Cultures of the Carolina Piedmont that was published in 1964, only reported on a small portion of the excavations, the 1950 excavations, right? And so most of those were up in this area. The subsequent work in the 1970s was unanalyzed and unreported, and as a dewy-eyed graduate student at Chapel Hill, I was looking at the collections there, and I was just amazed at that, and I thought, well, maybe something might be done with this material since it had never been analyzed before. So, long story short, I wrote a proposal for my dissertation, and I analyzed some 80 units. That's what the lower block represents. But I took a different approach at the analysis, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Let me, before we move on, let me give you some big picture context of what we're talking about. As I said, North Carolina looked very different than it does today when the first Carolinians came into what is now North Carolina. We're talking about a time right at the end of the last ice age, right? Sometime after 13,000 years ago, when at the end of what geologists call the Pleistocene, or the Great Ice Age. And so we had the first humans coming into North America and into the Carolinas. They were adapting to climatic conditions that were different plant and animal communities that we have today, lower sea levels, right? And it's only in the past few thousand years that we have sort of the modern plant and animal communities, the modern climates that we have today. So these people were living in small, low population densities, what anthropologists refer to as bands. We're talking about collections of families, maybe between 25 and 50 people that identified as a social group, interacting with similar sort of social groups across the landscape. These were hunters and gatherers, right? This was long before agriculture, long before any domesticated plants. So these individuals were hunting and gathering wild animals, hunting wild animals, and gathering wild plants. And as such, these groups were seasonally nomadic, right? We infer that based upon sort of ethnographic and historic examples of hunters and gatherers. Hunters and gatherers can't live in one place very long. Why? Because they eat themselves out of house at home, right? They move in response to the seasonal availability of resources, right? And so not all plants or animals are available year-round in one location. And so the prehistoric hunter-gatherers had a keen knowledge of the environment, of the landscape, and they weren't wandering randomly across the landscape. When they moved, they knew where they were going, and they knew why they were going there. All right. So this is the context for these earliest North Carolinians, and this is the context for which we're trying to interpret the Hardaway site. All right, now we'll fast forward to 1960s, right? The 50s and 60s. Shortly after Coe began his excavations there, he was interested in understanding the artifact typology and chronology. At the time, it was basically unestablished in North Carolina archaeology. That is, archaeologists knew there was a series of artifact types, and for those of us who are interested in the earliest pre-pottery periods, the projectile points are of particular interest because they help us tell time, right? They help us tell time. And so, but it was really unknown what time period any particular point type might be associated with. So, because of the unique geological conditions under which these sites formed along the Yadkin River, Coe could tease out the various occupation levels, and what he found was that more or less one occupation level is associated with one projectile point type, right? And that's what's illustrated in this diagram here. And that's why you can't talk about Hardaway without talking about the other sites, because you need the composite here to put together the 12,000 year typology and chronology for the state. So these are profiles, these are schematic profiles of each of these sites. And here some of these sites had fairly deep deposits, right? And based on the law of superposition, the geological principle that the deeper you dig represents time, right? The deeper the hole, the further back in time you go, assuming these are fairly undisturbed levels. And that's what Coe found at these sites. And so each one of these, this is the Gaston site, Lauder's Ferry, Dorschik site, and then the Hardaway site here. And by stringing these together, comparing similar point types across the site, he created this whole lengthy chronology. And so, for example, the important point here is the Guilford point, because the Guilford point links these three sites together here, right? Guilford is the deepest component at the Gaston site. Gaston site is on the Roanoke River, right? But it was part of the formative cultures, but it's not on the Yadkin. But Dorschik and Lauder's Ferry were. So you have the Guilford component here. It's the deepest component at these sites, but it's not the deepest at the Dorschik site. And so what Coe found was their point types, occupations even deeper, right? And so he knows by virtue of linking these sites together that anything found above the Guilford point is younger, anything below is older. At Hardaway, though, Hardaway was particularly important because it has the earliest sequence of any of these sites, right? What he found, though, was that it's interesting that the stratigraphy is more compressed, and part of this is due to the plow. He found Stanley through Middle Archaic, through Woodland, right? Several thousand years of point types in the upper levels, but they had been plowed. That upper knoll that you saw on that previous slide, it had been farmed for decades. And when you farm, you churn up levels, right? You take undisturbed levels and you churn them up like a Cuisinart, right? And you mix up the points. So you don't find them in their proper sequence there. But in the undisturbed levels below the plow zone, he did find even earlier point types, which represents really the contribution of the Hardaway site to this whole sequence, right? It's the earliest part, and the other sides bookend the latter part. So this, and so these names, I should add here, these names, where do these names come from? Well, where do you think Morrow Mountain name came from, right? Where do you think Badin Point came from? The Uwharrie Point, right? So these are point type names that had been previously unclassified, and so Coe took some of the important landmarks, right, from right here, and labeled these points in that fashion, right? Better take notes. I'm going to give you a quiz here in a few minutes, all right? Okay, so what do these points look like? Well, this is the famous chronology. This is probably the most consulted figure in the history of southeastern archaeology, right? This one figure here that Coe put together. And so he has the various point types. The Hardaway down here goes from a lancelet with a lancelet-shaped triangular blade with ears on it and a deeply concave base to a notch point, side notched, corner notch, and then a variety of stem points, right? And then late in prehistory, you go to true arrowheads, small triangular points. The earlier points, oftentimes referred to as arrowheads, but they're not. They were hafted on the ends of small spears or small darts, right? And thrown by hand, not with the. They weren't propelled by a bow, right? And so this Coe then worked out that sequence and then identified these point types. Another point, no pun intended, that is often overlooked in this is that Coe didn't create the types as much as he confirmed them, right? And I don't mean by that statement to diminish what he did. In fact, I think it makes it even more important. That is, the point types he identified, he linked to point types, sometimes named, sometimes unnamed, elsewhere across the southeast, and then by that sort of creating temporal links with sites all across the eastern woodlands, right? And so, for example, and this is, I know you can't read this, this is from my new book, right? The table here, where Coe talks about the Hardaway Dalton, right? And he references the Dalton points in Arkansas and Missouri, right? The Savannah River points. Guess where the Savannah River point was first identified, right? And then many of these are previously unnamed elsewhere. Stanley, Morrow Mountains, but he describes similar points elsewhere in the east and even a little bit west of the Mississippi River. So that's significant because then it allows archaeologists to think in a big landscape way, right? And so while Hardaway site, we like it because it's right here in North Carolina, right? Archaeologists elsewhere in North America like it because they can link chronological similarities to their sites elsewhere, right? And so Coe, to his credit, had that big picture mentality when he was writing up his work, right? So, typology and chronology, right? And so that was the problem, if you will, that Coe was interested in trying to identify. And remember, one other thing, this is before radiocarbon dating, right? Didn't come into play really until the 50s, about the time Coe was writing this up. There's only 3 or 4 radiocarbon dates, absolute dates, in Coe's book, right? And that's because carbon dating was a new technique. Today we have hundreds of dates, not only in North Carolina, but around the southeast, that helps us flesh out putting absolute dates to the chronology, right? So Coe created that sequence, and we know point A is older or younger than point B, but not necessarily how old. Now, Coe and others put guesstimates on there, and they were pretty close, if not a little conservative. But today we have the virtue of having dated sites elsewhere with similar point types, so now that we can put a chronology, an absolute dates on this relative chronology in the way that Coe was unable to at the time. All right, so that was like the 50s and 60s. That's what archaeologists were interested in doing. Well, at that point, we got a handle on time and space, right? We know where we are as archaeologists in time and place on the landscape. Well, then around the 1980s, archaeologists became interested in answering other kinds of questions like, what was going on at these sites, right? As we know, they're hunters and gatherers and are moving about the landscape, but what were the particular activities undertaken at these sites? And they're probably not the same activities undertaken all the time at other sites. And where were the Hardaway folks going, if we're assuming they're not living there year round? Where did they go when they left Hardaway? So this can be broadly placed under the umbrella of Archaic period adaptations, right? We're moving from typology and chronology to bigger picture questions about adaptations. How did they get by, right? And so that's where I became interested in looking at the Hardaway assemblage from a functional adaptational perspective, right? Do you follow me on that? So Then sort of site function. I had two broad questions. What were the activities that were being undertaken at Hardaway? And that is, what do the stone tools tell us about that? So I looked at the functions of the stone tools to try to get a handle of that. There are certainly implications in Coe's work with regard to that, but that wasn't the primary question he was interested in. He just wanted to know how old everything was. What's the chronology? That's the first thing you got to do, right? And so I then became interested in this question of adaptation. So functions, what was going on at Hardaway, and then where did people go when they left Hardaway? And more importantly, how do you know that? How do you get a handle on that? And that's where looking at stone raw material, identifying the Quarry Mountains and Morrow Mountain in particular is an important fingerprint, if you will, to help identify a signature of movement around the landscape. And that involved a quarry survey and a collection survey, and I'll tell you about that in a second, right? So that's the basis of my work. And so I looked at about 2,500 tools and tens of thousands of pieces of debitage, the little broken up flakes, right? And I don't have time to go into all the detail, but I do have a book that you can read about that, right? But here's the real takeaway in my mind was one of the primary functions of the Hardaway site was to retool, to gear up. And in other words, they're making stone tools to replace expended and exhausted toolkits, right? If they're moving around the environment, right, they're using up tool. They didn't eat stone, but they certainly consumed it, right? And that stone they use is not found everywhere. In fact, it's only found right here in the Quarry Mountains. The evidence of that is the abundance of rejects, manufacture rejects, tools that were broken in various stages of manufacture. 40% of those 2,500 tools, 42% represent these kinds of broken bifaces and incomplete tools, right? So these are, almost finished but broken, tools in the last stages. And then these are sort of earlier stage bifacial. Bi means two face sides. They were flaking stones off of both faces. And so you got early to late stage. And then preforms, these are the final stages. You go from a crude early stage to this is a continuum, right? Tools are made, it's a continuum. Flaking stone tools is like whittling wood, right? You're removing little pieces of wood shavings as you go to get the final product. Well, making a stone tool is the equivalent of wood shaving, except you're taking another stone or a piece of antler and you're literally knocking the rock, right, to remove flakes off of it to get the final product, right? And so there's 42% is made up of these early stage. I mean, these were obviously skilled craftspeople, right, to do this. But, they did make mistakes. Thank God they make mistakes because that tells us what's going on, right? I get as excited about a finished, broken one as I did a finished one, right? Because if that's what, archaeology is about, the big picture, right? It's not what you find, it's what you find out. And I was interested in finding out what was going on at the Hardaway site. That includes looking at the entire assemblage, all 2,500 tools, right? And so the other clue to this is that the finished tools that were present were often broken, tips missing, right? Or tips missing, or exhausted. They're worn down to a nub, right? And so they were bringing back these nearly expended toolkits, right? And they were gearing up, right? Gassing up, right? You refill your gas tank hopefully before you run out of gas, right? And so that's what these finish points, many of these represented the last stages of use. They came into Hardaway, threw them away, made a new one, rehafted, and good to go. Not only points, but their entire toolkit. And I don't have time to go into that, but there's a number of scrapers and other tools that are part of this portable hunter-gatherer toolkit. So that's the functional analysis, right? And but then the other question I wanted to know is where did people go once they left the Hardaway site? And one way to track that is again to track the movement of stone, right, from its source, its geological source, to the site wherever it is on the landscape, right? And to do that, it required knowing some geology. And so well, two things. First, I had to find a geologist, right, to help me out, and that's the late Bob Butler, is the geologist that I worked with at Chapel Hill, who had an intimate knowledge of this region, right? He had 3 decades that he'd been working in here, and in this region, and I invited him into the lab, and I said, where did this stone come from? Nobody had really asked that question. Interestingly enough, there had been a lot of assumptions, and they thought, well, there's so much of it, it came from Hardaway. The problem is Hardaway sits on greenstone, right? That ain't the stone that these tools were made of. The stone that these Hardaway assemblage is made of is generically referred to as rhyolite, right? It's a metamorphosed, meta-igneous, metavolcanic rock, right? That is prevalent just south of the Hardaway site in Morrow Mountain State Park and the Uwharrie National Forest, right? And I love this sign. This is Uwharrie National Forest, land of many uses, right? Well, this was an important source of the economy, of the tool use of the prehistoric inhabitants of North Carolina. If you were a hunter-gatherer living in North Carolina 10,000 years ago, you knew where Morrow Mountain was. You knew where the Uwharrie National Forest is, because that is the place where you can get your stone. It's unique geologically in the Carolinas, right? The other important quality is not only its location, but there's 2 qualities of stone that make stone useful as a tool. If you're interested in chopping down a tree, killing a deer, skinning a hide, whatever, you need something that's hard, right? All stone is hard, right? But the quality that separates useful stone for stone tools is a property called conchoidal fracture. That's a geological term. Conchoidal means cone-like, right? And the stone here at Morrow Mountain and elsewhere in the Uwharrie is that rhyolite that caps all the mountains there, has this conchoidal fracture. That means that if you know where to hit the stone, the angle, and how hard to hit a stone, you can remove a flake in a predictable fashion, right? Now, I don't flake. I don't nap. Flint napping is the generic term for making stone tools. I've done enough of that just to know that it takes a real skill, right? That's a real acquired knowledge. I'd rather make my living about studying about it than doing it, right? And so this stone here has that great quality of conchoidal fracture. I've seen skilled flint nappers take a chunk of rhyolite, and then they'll take a magic marker and draw like a little oval on it, right? And they'll outline a little oval on it, and then they'll hit it, and that size flake comes off, right? They predicted how big and the size and shape of the flake, right? So, not surprisingly, the earliest North Carolinians had this skill. I mean, if they didn't, this was life and death for them, right? Right? And so you bet that they knew where the raw material was they needed to make their toolkits, right? So the Uwharrie Mountains, here's Morrow Mountain, just a few miles south of the Hardaway site, and these little white caps you can see, this is the Uwharrie Mountain range, right? And Morrow Mountain is really about the southern extent of this intermittent shade of mountains between here and Asheboro. That's the source of righteous rock here in North Carolina, right? And so most of these white caps here are capped with this rhyolite, right? And so this rock was formed 500 million years ago, right? When volcanoes, when the continent didn't exist and volcanoes were erupting, right? And creating this lava. Right? And then subsequently it's metamorphosed, changed by heat and pressure. By low grade, that's what gives it that conchoidal fracture, right? And that's important. So we found quarries. So Dr. Butler and I spent the better part of 3 winters hiking off and on in the Quarry Mountains. It was a wonderful time. That was my field work, right? I didn't dig at Hardaway, but my field work was out surveying the mountains in the Morrow Mountain and the Quarry National Forest and places in Asheboro looking for quarries, right? Trying to see what the stone was to match it to the Hardaway site. And so match it we did. And so this is Bob Butler. And virtually every, as I said, all those mountains, mountaintops, Wolf Den, Shingle Trap Mountain, Tater Top, Falls Mountain, all those mountains are prehistoric quarries, right? You know, most people don't realize that, right? But they were sources of stone, various types of rhyolite. And Bob mapped out the rhyolite. There's at least 4 different flavors of rhyolite. I won't go into detail there, but Morrow Mountain is unique among this because it is about the only place with this very high silica content with high silica with a great conchoidal fracture that gives it that quality that these inhabitants were looking for to make their tools. This is an erosional ditch. This is Bob Butler. This is an erosional ditch on the side of Morrow Mountain, right? You see all that kind of white, sort of gray, right? You know what that is? Those are artifacts, right? That's busting up stone. That's quarried stone. If you've, I hope you've been to Morrow Mountain. If not, when you leave here, you got to go to Morrow Mountain. Drive the top of Morrow Mountain. That's your homework, right? Go and then walk out to the picnic tables. From the parking lot to the picnic tables, you cannot take a step without stepping on broken up flakes. And where do those flakes come from? They've been quarried. There was probably a Native American on these mountaintops every day for 10,000 years, right? So this was a place where an immense amount of quarrying activity took place, right? And this is a tree fall from Shingle Trap Mountain, and you see the roots, the root balls. This was after Hurricane, when was that? Hugo, Hugo, right? And so the forest looked like pickup sticks. That's what I used to. Well, y'all are my age, so you understand pickup sticks. When I say pickup sticks to my students, they look at me like, is that a video game, right, Dr. Daniel? You know? Okay. And so it looked like, the trees looked like pickup sticks laying out there. But the interesting thing, and in the root balls that they turned up, all that is broken up quarried rock, right? This was the OPEC of prehistory in North Carolina, right? If oil is the thing that drives our economy, right? Then stone was the resource that drove prehistoric economies, right? Okay, so what is the makeup of the Hardaway assemblage? So this is about 1,900 artifacts I looked at, and this is the percentage, right? This should add up to 100% if my math is right. And you'll notice 68%, almost 70% is apheric rhyolite. That's Morrow Mountain rhyolite. Apheric is a term geologists refer to the fine-grained, homogeneous nature of that stone. And then there's a number of other metavolcanic, metasedimentary stones, rhyolitic tuffs. Those are probably from the Asheboro area. Metasedimentary stone, that's probably somewhere right along the Yadkin River. Porphyritic rhyolites, that's another flavor of rhyolite that's present in the Quarry Mountains, Falls Mountain, and some of the other mountains are this porphyritic rhyolite. I won't go into detail there. So 90% or more of the assemblage probably came from right around that area, right? And so that makes sense as one of the reasons why Hardaway site was located where it was its proximity to the Quarry Mountains. People were returning here to gear up, to retool, to regas their tanks, so to speak, as then later move around the landscape for the remaining part of the year. But I think they came back here fairly on some kind of annual or regular interval in order to get the stone they needed. All right, so where did they go? So after we identified the location that, we're pretty sure that the Hardaway site, the Quarry Mountains is the source of that stone, then the question is, where did they go once they left Hardaway? And so one way to do that is to look, as I said, the movement of stone from source to site. We had the source, right? So where else in site, where else on the landscape do we see Morrow Mountain rhyolite? And so that required me to go out and look at other collections. And so I looked at some 3,000 points in collections from 3,100 points, more or less, from 25 counties in North Carolina. And I did this sort of deliberately in two transects, if you will. So I looked at collections, two transects perpendicular to each other. One transect was counties, looked at points from collections, the Yadkin down the PD, right into South Carolina, right? The North and South Carolina line didn't exist 10,000 years ago, right? So you got to take a big picture here and ignore the state lines. Then I looked at collections in a transect across the eastern part of the Piedmont, right? And many of these were collections that from sites that the RLA at Chapel Hill had curated in their collections, but that has also required me to go out and look at private collections, to fill in that gap that from locations that weren't in the RLA collections. So I spent several weeks driving around looking at collections, and I said, Randy, it don't get any better than this, right? Driving around the countryside, working with collectors, looking for Hardaway points, Palmer and Kirk quarter notch points, and looking at the stone, right? And guess what I found? I found a lot of rhyolite. I found a lot of rhyolite points. And in fact, this gold area here, this red dot is Morrow Mountain, right? And so I found points made of Quarry rhyolite, right? Roughly equal frequencies and equal distances across these two transects. So I got these two transects, and then I just kind of, connected them in a circle. And so, so for example, this is a collection of Palmer and Kirk quarter notch points from Chesterfield County, South Carolina, just within the South Carolina, just south of the border, right? 40 miles, and that is pretty distinctive flow-banded rhyolite, that flow-banded with that zebra-like grayish tone. That's a weathering that this rhyolite gets after 10,000 years. We all look a little weathered, right? Even rock does, right? And so this is sort of some of the characteristic traits that I was looking for. So, in fact, this rhyolite is moving over 100 miles, 120 miles from Morrow Mountain in both directions, right? And even further, this is the sort of main range that I think these people were moving in. That doesn't mean they never went over here. In fact, I've been doing excavations along the Tar River, not far from ECU, and I've found a couple of points and scrapers that when we dug them up, I told my students, I know where that stone came from, right? And it ain't from around here. It ain't from eastern North Carolina. In the coastal plain, we don't have anything like this stone, right? We have quartz, and quartz can be good, but it ain't no rhyolite, right? And so, this then is kind of a big picture here to expand upon our knowledge of Hardaway, to give us a sense of the range in which these people were moving. And we're talking about over thousands of years. You don't create a pattern like this in 2 or 3 years, right? We're talking about millennia here, centuries to millennia to create this pattern. But as people are moving about the landscape, they discard their points, and then they're picked up 10,000 years later, put in a collection, and then Randy comes along and says, "Ha, yeah, that's what I'm looking for," right? All right, so that's the research significance, and really, that's the important part of what Hardaway is. And so I just tried to put a new spin and try to find out something about the Hardaway site that we didn't know, right? All right. So there's other levels of significance here. And this is what I refer to as educational significance. And I alluded to this earlier. Students are still looking at the Hardaway collections, right? They're curated at UNC. There for student training, right? To learn. It's one thing to see a picture of a Hardaway point, right? But you ever picked up the actual Hardaway point that's pictured in formative cultures? I have, right? And that was pretty cool for a young graduate student, right? My DNA is all over those points in the RLA. If they ever go try to extract DNA from stone, they better start with my DNA, because that'll be a big signature, right? So, but public outreach is an important part too. I'm a firm believer in that. And so there was the Alcoa worked with UNC a few years ago, the Ancient Carolinians exhibit. How many of y'all saw that, right? Oh, come on. You got to be more than that, right? It was a traveling exhibit that went all across the state, right? It was a key public outreach effort that brought the Hardaway site to places all over the state. More recently, there's the Ancient North Carolinians website that the RLA has. And I urge you to go there. There's a wealth of information not only about Hardaway there, but sites all over the state. They have three-dimensional images. You want to look at a Hardaway, the next best thing, there's no replacing just actually picking up a Hardaway point, but the next best thing is these 3D images where you can rotate it right on your computer screen. And that's part of the educational efforts that the RLA is doing using the Hardaway material, right? So the educational significance should not be undervalued. Then there's what I call the stewardship significance, right? And this is, these different categories overlap with each other. You can't have research and education without having good stewardship. And this is the curation of these materials, right? And so as was mentioned, Alcoa donated some 2 million artifacts to the RLA several years ago. And that, that was part of my dissertation research, right? That was pretty important to me, right? And so the research and educational value of the Hardaway collections transcends the decades, right? From the 50s and 60s into the 21st century. And there'll be somebody working on the Hardaway site in decades to come. Long after we're all part of the archaeological record, right? There will be people working on the Hardaway site. Why? Because it's curated. It's like a library, right? It's a library that people can have, researchers and students, and hopefully a museum, right? That people can have access to in the future. Stewardship is paramount here, right? And then the last level of significance I want to mention here is, and this too I think is often overlooked, is the relationship between a professional archaeologist, and Dorshik, an amateur, right? Now, I get it. There is full disclosure. Those relationships that the professionals have had with the avocational community has been, there's been some levels of tension that have existed over the years, and it goes back even to the 1930s, even in Dorshik's time, right? This is a newsletter from 1938, right? And this is an excerpt about tendencies for professionals to be too critical of amateurs, right? and to overlook and underestimate the value of their collections and their contributions, right? I get it. I'm a pointy head professional, right? And so, but I think we can bridge that divide, right, in a way that advances if we're really interested in understanding the past. And there's a lot of collectors out there. I've talked to collectors for 3 decades, right? And I get it. They're passionate about it as I am, right? In fact, I'm jealous. I look on Facebook and there's some guy out there collecting, and I'm sitting in my office, and I go, well, damn, I wish I could be out there, working, So, so where does this tension come from? It's rooted in the increased professionalization of archaeology in the last century, right? What do I mean by that? Archaeology is one of the unique professions in which that one can claim professional status, right? I get paid to do what I do. I'm a professional. I've had training, right? But one can claim an amateur status too that nobody bats an eye at, right? They say, if I said I'm an amateur archaeologist, an avocationist, people say, well, that's cool, an interesting hobby. I say, yeah. What if I said I was an amateur lawyer? What if I said I was an amateur brain surgeon, right? Well, people might say, well, you're kind of strange. Yeah, right. Okay, so this increased professionalization has created a divide, an unnecessary divide, right? That has created a level of friction that the profession is acknowledging, and I'm a big advocate of this, right? Of trying to close the gap here. And if we're working together here, then the difference here is the different attitudes towards the archaeological record, right? As a professional archaeologist, my attitude is stewardship. Stewardship, right? Protecting the archaeological resource and then publishing on what we do, right? That's stewardship, right? Collector's attitude is one of ownership, right? Ownership. We need to go from a collecting ethic to a conservation ethic, right? And so if we are all interested in the same thing, then we need to work together to promote proper stewardship. And stewardship is that if you're a collector, right, you need to make sure your collections are cataloged in some way, right? If you're collecting a point, then the onus is on you, if you really are interested in preserving the past, is to make a catalog. Just put a dot on a map where that artifact came from, write a little number on it, and then work with some professional archaeologist, right, to record where that information comes from, right? That's stewardship, right? That's stewardship. And towards that end, just recent, in the past few years, the SAA, the Society of American Archaeology, created a task force to address this various question. You can go to the SAA webpage, saa.org, right? And you can find this. I'm not going to read all this to you, but notice the underlined parts. It should be the case that professionals recognize that some collections have scientific value, right? Some collections have scientific value. Not every shoebox of artifacts warrants being preserved or curated, but some collections do. If they're properly maintained, if they're properly recorded, and if they're willing to work with the professional archaeologist, right, then that is good stewardship. And so it's up to us as professionals to encourage responsible stewards. That's the collectors being responsible about where they collect and about how they collect. And then work towards recording some of this information. The Office of State Archaeology, the OSA webpage, has a one-page site form that's intended for amateurs to fill out to record site locations. Now I know what you're thinking. Oh, I put that site on there and that somebody's going to come in and swoop in. The archaeology police are going to come. It ain't going to happen, right? It ain't going to happen. There's just not enough of us around to start swooping down on every site that exists. But, what happens 10 years, 20 years? You got to think long term, right? Someday we're all going to be part of the archaeological record. But that site you recorded 50, 60 years from now may be in the way of some construction, right? And if if that site's recorded, that will alert the professionals about that potential site, and something should be done to salvage that before it becomes, part of interstate whatever, right? And so this is it, to capture archaeological data that might otherwise be lost. And then ultimately here, encourage responsible and responsive stewards to donate their documented collections. Again, I know what you're thinking. I ain't donating my collection. I spent 60 years collecting this stuff. I get it, right? I get it. But what happens again when you die? I've heard of so many collections that have been broken up and sold and dispersed to the winds. Is that the legacy? Is that the legacy that you want to leave? And I tell collectors that, you make a will, right, for all your important stuff. Include your collections in part of that will, right? Work with somebody to make sure that that's your legacy, right? Dorshik donated. I missed that, didn't I? Let me go back. Dorshik was way ahead of his time, right? This is from the RLA catalog sheet, projectile points, pottery stone, Dorshik, Stanley County, ST4. That's the Hardaway site. 11,000 artifacts he donated, right? That's just a small part of the Dorshik collection. That's only from Hardaway. He collected a number of sites up and down the Yadkin River. I don't know what the relationship really was between Coe and Dorshik. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall there. But it's a relationship that was decades ahead of its time, right? Dorshik left a legacy, right? He left a legacy with that collection by donating to the RLA that is an important part of the Hardaway assemblage to this day, right? He was being a good steward, right? All right, and so I'll end with this. So why is Hardaway significant? Well, if you're looking for evidence of that, you only need to look at, if there's only one criteria for why Hardaway is important, it became a National Historic Landmark in 1990, right? They don't give these out to every site, around the corner, right? This is a designation by the Secretary of Interior, the National Park Service, right? On sites that have truly national significance, right? And so for all the reasons I just discussed, right, Hardaway rises to that level of significance. And I think all y'all should be proud of that. You're living right within a stone's throw, right, so to speak, of one of the most significant archaeological sites in the country, right? And that is something to, I think, celebrate, right? All right. I know I think I've been, all right. So a lot of times people end their slides with sunsets. Well, I end mine with book discounts, right? And I'm shamelessly, all right, I got 2 books for you, right? And I've arranged with my editor, University of Alabama Press, you can get 30% discounts, right? And I have flyers up here if you're interested. I have a couple of copies of the book if you'd like to thumb through them, right? And 30% discount. It's never too early to shop for Christmas, right? All right. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.